January 27, 1945. Cold winter air hangs over the Pacific, thin clouds drifting above the pale blue horizon. Far below, the ocean is calm, almost indifferent. High in the sky, silver shapes cut through the thin atmosphere, long-winged fighters, their engines humming with mechanical precision. The sound is not thunderous. It is steady, persistent, unrelenting. The sound carries inland, beyond the post, beyond the cities, beyond the places that Japanese airmen once believed were unreachable. This was the moment when distance itself stopped being a defense. For years, Japan's military strategy had relied on geography as a shield. The vast Pacific, the great distances between islands, the interior of the Japanese homeland, all of it was believed to form a natural barrier. Enemy aircraft could strike ports, coastlines, naval bases. But the deep interior, factories far from the sea, airfields hidden behind mountains, these were considered safe, protected by distance, fuel limits, and the assumed limitations of American aircraft technology. Before 1944, Japanese air doctrine taught that long-range escort fighters were impractical. Bombers could fly far, but fighters, it was believed, could not accompany them deep inland in meaningful numbers. The skies over the interior were expected to remain Japanese-controlled. Defensive strategy was built on this assumption. Air defense networks were positioned around cities, ports, and naval installations. Radar coverage and interceptor squadrons were concentrated where attacks were expected to come. But war evolves faster than doctrine. By late 1944, the strategic balance in the Pacific changed. The United States had captured the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, placing Japan within reach of the new B-29 Superfortress bombers. These aircraft could fly higher, farther, and carry heavier bomb loads than anything before them. But bombers alone were vulnerable. They needed protection. And for the first time in aviation history, protection was no longer limited by range. The P-51 Mustang changed the geometry of war. With its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, laminar flow wings, and external drop tanks, the Mustang could escort bombers over extraordinary distances. It wasn't just a fighter. It was a long-range aerial presence, a machine designed not merely to intercept, but to stay, to remain in enemy airspace, to dominate it. When American planners realized this, strategies shifted from coastal pressure to deep penetration. By early 1945, Mustang squadrons were operating from Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island carved from the Pacific at an unimaginable human cost. The island itself became a forward lung for American air power, allowing fighters to reach the Japanese mainland and escort bombers all the way to inland targets, factories, rail hubs, aircraft production centers, and fuel depots that had never been seriously threatened before. Japanese pilots did not expect what they encountered. They had trained to intercept bombers, large formations, predictable paths, heavy silhouettes in the sky. They expected lone fighters near the coast, short engagements, fuel-limited skirmishes. What they experienced instead was something entirely different. Coordinated fighter formations deep over Japanese territory.
Flying with confidence, loitering, circling, engaging repeatedly, not retreating toward the sea, but pressing forward into the heartland. The psychological impact was immediate. Reports from Japanese air defense units described unexpected fighter presence far beyond projected operational ranges. Pilots recorded engagements hundreds of kilometers inland. Radar operators tracked formations that did not turn back. They continued forward. They stayed. American Mustangs were not simply appearing, they were operating. Historical records from the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service and Navy Air Service reveal confusion and alarm. Defensive command structures were slow to adapt. Fuel shortages limited interception capacity. Training shortages reduced pilot effectiveness. Aircraft production had suffered from bombing and resource shortages. Meanwhile, American production numbers continued to rise. By 1945, the United States was producing nearly 96,000 aircraft annually. Japan, facing industrial collapse, fuel scarcity, and infrastructure damage, could not match the scale. The imbalance was not only material, it was psychological. Japanese pilots had grown up in a culture that valued controlled airspace, sacred homeland skies, and the belief that the interior of Japan was inviolable. Now, foreign fighters were not only entering that space, they were operating freely within it. Mustangs escorted B-29 bombers to inland aircraft factories in Musashino, Nakajima production plants, railway hubs in Nagoya, and fuel facilities far from coastal defense zones. The interior was no longer protected by distance. Geography had failed. One recurring detail appears in multiple accounts from both sides: the sound of the engines, not the explosions. Not the gunfire, the engines. The steady, continuous hum of American aircraft engines overhead, not in sudden raids, but in sustained presence. That sound became a symbol of inevitability. Not chaos, but continuity. Not panic, but persistence. For American pilots, that engine sound meant reliability, a machine that would carry them home. For Japanese defenders, it meant something else entirely: permanence. The Mustang did not symbolize destruction alone. It symbolized reach. It symbolized an industrial system that could build machines that crossed oceans, sustained operations, and returned again and again. It symbolized a political system capable of mobilizing factories, logistics, training pipelines, fuel production, and infrastructure at a scale never before seen in human history. In documented pilot reports, Japanese aviators described the shock of encountering fighters deep inland, often after scrambling too late, climbing too slowly, arriving with insufficient altitude advantage. Tactical superiority was no longer theirs. The air war had shifted from interception to survival. American after-action reports described extended loiter times, multiple engagements, escort continuity, and deep penetration confidence. This was not a raid, it was control. And with control came transformation. The belief that the homeland skies were sacred began to erode. The idea of strategic depth collapsed. The interior was no longer safe. The war was no longer distant. It was overhead. Factories that once operated under the assumption of protection were now exposed. Rail lines were vulnerable. Fuel depots burned. Aircraft plants were destroyed before their planes could ever reach the runway. The Mustang did not just escort bombers. It dismantled illusions. One sound, repeated day after day, became symbolic: the engine hum in the sky. Not sudden, not chaotic, consistent, predictable, endless. It became the sound of American abundance: fuel, steel, logistics, training, production, coordination. Democracy expressed not through speeches, but through systems, through assembly lines, through supply chains, through standardized parts, through training programs, through logistics maps, through maintenance crews, through pilots rotated and replaced without collapse. This was not individual heroism alone. It was structural power. By 1945, Japanese air defense doctrine had fundamentally changed. The concept of interior safety was abandoned. Defensive strategies shifted to desperation measures: fuel conservation, limited sorties, kamikaze operations, and symbolic resistance replaced strategic air superiority. The transformation was not ideological in words, but in reality. Perception shifted from control to containment, from dominance to endurance, from strategy to survival. And all of it began with the realization that the sky itself was no longer a boundary. The Mustang's presence inland was not just tactical, it was philosophical. It meant that distance no longer protected ideology, that oceans no longer insulated belief systems, that isolation was no longer defense. The world had become smaller. The battlefield had become continuous. And that engine sound, that steady mechanical rhythm, became the echo of something larger than war itself. It became the sound of a system built on production, coordination, infrastructure, and sustained capacity. A system where power was
not just in weapons, but in organization, not just in courage, but in continuity, not just in battles, but in logistics. When Japanese airmen looked up and saw Mustangs over inland targets, they were not just seeing aircraft. They were seeing the collapse of distance, the failure of geography, the end of isolation, the exposure of the interior. They were witnessing a new kind of warfare, one where borders did not define safety and where airspace itself belonged to whoever could sustain presence, not just strike once. And long after the bombs fell, long after the smoke cleared, one memory remained in countless accounts: the sound of engines overhead, not as terror, but as inevitability. A reminder that freedom in the modern world is not only defended by soldiers, it is built by systems, sustained by abundance, protected by reach, and carried across oceans and continents by the quiet, relentless hum of machines that never had to turn back.